that don't wish to be heard or seen, you can write your comments or your questions. I've stepped into this. This session's actually going to be a little bit different than its articulation and its framing, because I don't do family law or personal sort of kind of law. I do asylum work, and I do it in Canada, not in South Africa. I want to throw some things out, some things to think about, some things that have happened in Canada, how some Muslims have tried to bring in so-called Sharia law and the pros and mostly the cons around that. Some things to think about, and then maybe we can actually have a conversation and people can share their views and any experiences that they have had, because I think most of the folks here are South African, except for a sprinkling of Americans and Indonesian in that corner over there, a couple of Brits over here, right? So let's see what kind of conversation we have. And this is not 2 hours, this is an hour, right? Or less, because we've already used up some time. So you're recording, you're streaming now? All right. In my earlier session today, I quoted from, I gave a quote by Dr. Cornel West. Cornel West is an African-American academic, theologian, fabulous human being. And the quote that with you is what love looks like in. Drink that in. Right? We're Muslim, right? We go to the mosque and we hear, or we go to an Islamic conference and we'll hear, Islam is about justice, right? Islam is about justice. There's really any justice visible in the mosque, especially if you're a woman or if you're queer or you're not Arabized enough or et cetera, right? But this is what we hear. And for those people who are Muslim, who also follow the Sufi path or who are influenced by Sufism, then you will also know that the foundation of the Sufi path, of the Dervish path, is love. That Allah is the beloved. This is what Mevlana Rumi taught, and this is what all the great awliyas that have been sent have also taught, and all the great prophets. So for us as Muslims, this phrase brought to us by a Christian theologian, justice is what love looks like in public. Now, how many of you felt that love? Because I think the reality is that for many of us, Muslim or not, male, female, whatever, justice is something that we still struggle with. Fatima, you talked about the South African Constitution and the strides that that have been made simply in the context of the contents of the Constitution. I told you I do asylum work, right? So I've been doing this for 22 years. And in the first 10 or so years of my work, I had a lot of clients from Latin America. These are fabulous constitutions. The American Constitution, all men are created equal. Right, except when they wrote that, Black people were not considered human. Right? Women, even white women, weren't fully considered human. So all men meant white men. Didn't even mean white women. Okay? And so a white woman was 3/4 of a white man, and then a Black man was something less than that, and a Black woman was something less than that, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth, until there's nothing left. Right? So you can have a fabulous constitution, but if you don't have a mechanism, if you don't have a vehicle to enforce that constitution or that articulation, then it's worth less than the paper it's written on. Women's rights. Transforming human rights from a gender perspective. So a lot of times laws are passed or are adopted or mechanisms are put into place, and some people are just invisible, right? In Canada, for a long time, women couldn't get maternity leave, paid maternity leave, you couldn't get it. So some women took this to the courts. Court said, we're not, people are not being discriminated, women are not being discriminated because they're women. The discrimination is of people who get pregnant. Sounds like some of our imams have the split hairs, right? Right? So imagine, because I mean, so far our technology will bring us there, but so far men don't generally get pregnant and don't give birth. But the court said, no, this is not gender discrimination. This is discriminating against people who get pregnant. And so there is no arguable case because this is not a protected ground. Okay, brilliant, yes? Nice way to split hairs. So invisibility. So we've seen that all men are created equal means only certain kind of men, that getting pregnant is discriminating against people who get pregnant is not gender discrimination. And so we keep going. Now we also heard gorgeous lady with the kafia. Remind me your name? Virginia. You talked about the state of affairs in South Africa. Yes, we have equality, we have marriage equality, we have entrenched rights as LGBTIQ people, but corrective rape is a phenomenal problem, especially of Black lesbians, right? There's violence, even in a country like Canada. We have one of the biggest pride I believe is Egyptian in origin, and he wrote forward to Dr. Said. This characterizes patriarchy as an offense against morality and against Islam that eradicates women's moral agency, erases and marginalizes women, and most significantly negates the possibility of true surrender to God by displacing God's authority. So in my opinion, and when I said this in my khutbah a few weeks ago, I got a gasp. So I don't know whether I'll get a gasp today. We'll see. So in my opinion, Abu Fadl declares patriarchy as a form of shirk. A little bit, yeah. As a form of shirk. Attributing partners to the one God. Because, quote, he says, quote, from a theological point of view, the worst form of despotism and oppression are when human beings usurp the role of God and exploit the name of the divine in the process of erasing the autonomy and the will of other human beings. You all get that? Shall I repeat it? Okay. So I said, I think that what he is saying is that patriarchy is a form of shirk, of attributing. Patriarchy is a form of shirk because it attributes partners to God. And how does it? Because it tells us that women are somehow lesser than men, and that between women and God stands man. And that man translates, interprets, and implements God's will for other people, particularly women, right? So he says, from a theological point of view, the worst form of despotism and oppression are when human beings usurp, take away the role of God, and exploit the name of the divine in the process of erasing the autonomy and the will of other human beings. To give you a Muslim example, right? If you're around and are wondering where to go for Eid in Cape Town, Mohsen has asked me to give the khutbah at the People's Mosque for Eid. My khutbah is going to be on Sayyidina Hajar, the mother of Ismail. The Hajj is her tradition. It is her sunnah. It's not Abraham's sunnah. He just came by later and sacrificed an animal. She's the one who ran between Safa and Marwa. You can't, your Hajj is incomplete. It is incomplete if you don't run between Safa and Marwa. But your Hajj is complete if you don't sacrifice an animal. Okay? But if you go to Mecca, if you go for Hajj or for Umrah, and you're going between Safa and Marwa, there are signs that prohibit women from running. Because apparently the Wahhabis and the Salafis think that it's undignified for women to run. But the mother of Ismail, who is buried in the Haram Sharif, ran between Safa and Marwa. And God answered her because the angel Gabriel came to her and the gift of Zamzam flows for 5,000 years. But if you are a woman without an adult male, you can't go to Mecca. Well, I'm sorry, but Abraham dumped her in the valley. And she was there by herself. So who says women need a mahram to go to Mecca? Men. So all of a sudden, men have stood between woman and God and seem to know better than God. Right? You following me? We're all good. All right. This is what Khalid Abu Fadl is talking about. Patriarchy puts men between other human beings, women, queers, minorities, religious minorities, what have you, put themselves between those people and God. And that, he says, is zulm, it's oppression, it's despotism, it's oppression. But because you take away, because you know better than God, is that not a form of shirk? Is that not actually giving more power to these human beings than you are willing to give unto God? All right? So that's my little theological spiel. So fortunately, in the world that we live in today, we have a lot of domestic laws, and we have some international conventions that can be used. Okay? In Canada, a few years ago, we had a Muslim group that brought forward, they wanted to introduce Muslim family law, Sharia law, into Ontario family law, so that Muslims could be governed by Sharia. Now, how many times have you heard that the purpose of Sharia is justice? And how many times have we seen injustice done in the name of Sharia? Right? So if the purpose of Sharia is justice, and if justice is being served, then why do we need this mythical animal called Sharia in the context of modern contemporary law? Why do we need it? Purpose of Sharia is justice, but if we have a system that serves justice, that articulates justice, why do you want to go? If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? If it's broke, make it better. Why do you need to introduce a whole different set of things, which, and you know, ultimately what they really wanted to do is that they really wanted to have legally more than one wife. They also wanted to implement those parts of Sharia that say you only need to support, or those interpretation of their Sharia, because whose Sharia are you talking about, right? Because really what they wanted to do is to say, well, you know, I divorce thee, and I'll maintain you for a day or whatever their understanding of it is, and then be rid of that. Take your child away from you, because apparently their understanding is that they should have the child if they want. Right? So a number of Muslim groups got together and challenged this. Of course, they got called all kinds of names, these Muslim women, many of whom are my friends and my sisters and my aunties. They got called all sorts of names by these good Muslim men, these good Muslim brothers who supposedly want to implement God's law, right? But God's law is simple. It's justice and love. That, I think, for us as human beings, as Muslims, as people with consciences, should be our modus operandi. The international conventions that I want to bring to your attention include include a number of international conventions. Now, I believe you have a fabulous constitution, but I don't know what mechanisms you have, and maybe some of in the conversations that we're going to have, if any of you want to share any experiences, any things that have been taken before the court, how that has worked and what sort of happened, and the challenges both for women and within the Muslim and non-Muslim context, because, you know, even in a Muslim majority society, we live in a pluralistic world, right? And we live in a world where we're all interdependent. So nuclear meltdown in Japan is gonna hurt us no matter where we are, and hurt our children, and hurt our planet, and hurt our waters, and hurt our fish, and hurt our air. So there is no us and them anymore. We're all here together. And we're all going to live and we're all going to die together. So we might as well try to get to that point and start making it work from now, right? So one of the fundamental problems, I think, is the fact that women and minorities are often invisible. They're invisible in the articulation, in the formulation, and in the envisioning of laws. What kind of impact? A law that seems flat, that seems equal, may know in how it's applied, in its manifestation, on its impact in society, right? And I think also that when we are talking about, I think we need to talk more than rights. We need to move beyond human rights. My dad, I learned this from my dad. My dad passed away 3 years ago, and he and I used to fight like cats and dogs. But Allah bless him, because he did share some of his wisdom with me. And one of the things he said to me was, it's not enough to talk about rights, because rights are based on a concept of, you know, you have a right to. But actually, it goes beyond. There is the concept of human dignity, right? And dignity comes from the fact that Allah says to us, I am closer to you than your own jugular vein. God doesn't say, I am closer to this guy, closer than I am to that guy because he's white, or he's straight, or he's rich, let alone he, she, it, them, they, Muslim, non-Muslim, even believer, non-believer. God's relationship to every human being is exactly the same. It's our choice what kind of relationship we want to have with God. But God's relationship with us is the same, because God has the same intimacy with every single human being. And I will go further and say to every created atom in the universe. Right? Science now tells us that we have star particles, that we are made of solar dust. There are particles within us that are billions of years old. So we're not just interconnected to each other as human beings, we're interconnected to this planet, but we're actually interconnected to the universe. So let's not just talk about rights, let's talk about dignity. And so then it's not just even human dignity, but it's also the dignity of the planet, the dignity of how we treat our food. Can a battery chicken ever be halal? Do you know what a battery chicken is? A battery chicken are chickens that are born and raised in cages, and they never leave those cages. And sometimes those cages are so small that they actually cut into the flesh of the bird. So if the purpose of making food halal is to give the animal a merciful death, what good is a merciful death if you have never known a merciful life? Isn't it an insult to God's name to say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim over here? You should have been doing it when that little animal was born, before you put it in that cage, and never have put it in that cage, right? So this is where the notion of dignity supersedes even the issue of rights. But in the pursuit of rights, we have international conventions. Many of our countries are signatories. I was surprised, I was looking in preparation for today, that there are, I wasn't surprised that there are conventions on the rights of women, CEDAW, for example, and each country that is signatory has to provide annual reports. And fortunately, in many countries, there are civil or civic organizations that do annual reportings, shadow reports of what the government said, because of course the governments will say, we're applying this convention, we're meeting our obligations, and it's usually crap, right? They're usually not. Or they will, you know, have caveats so that they can not apply certain parts of it. And places like Saudi Arabia are signatories to some of these places. Now, let's talk about women's equality. You can't drive, you can't leave the country, you can't do this and you can't do that, and you're telling me there's equality? And then you say it's God's law. Right? So some of the conventions include, where did I list them? Before I get to that, so there are there are ways of taking these international conventions and taking them through your courts. Now again, that varies from country to country. In Canada, for example, if Canada ratifies one of these international conventions, it has to bring it into domestic legislation in order for it to be enforceable in domestic courts, right? In some circumstances, you can go to the international courts, but again, what's the teeth to that? At the end of it, what's really going to happen? Okay, and as an example, and it's not about governments, you know, oil companies get fines for dumping oil in the oceans. But they do it all the time because the fine is less than what it would cost them to clean up in the first place, right? So that's the truism. But I found this document that talked about some of the ways that, so the Convention Against Torture and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights was used in the Namibian Supreme Court to determine whether the use of chains on prisoners was constitutional. In Tanzania, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the African Charter on Human Rights, on Human and People's Rights, was used in holding that the equality guarantees in the Tanzania Bill of Rights overrides customary law. So a lot of these countries have signed and said, oh, but our customary law supersedes. But we also know who made customary law.
And they use sovereignty in this case.
They use?
Sovereignty.
Sovereignty, yes. Now, I'm going to end on that note and just say one thing. I told you I do asylum work. I have a lot of clients from Africa, and 80% of my clients are either LGBTI people or women fleeing domestic violence or people living with HIV, okay? So now we have a narrative in Africa that this is un-African, this meaning LGBT, homosexuality is un-African. What a load of crap. It's the law that is un-African because it was brought to us by the white colonial masters who themselves have shed that law, right? The British came, they brought us this law, did for us, and like good trained people, we stick to those laws like they're somehow gospel. Don't want that gospel personally. But look at how the tables have turned. And if you look in a place like Uganda, you've got evangelical American Christian groups who are coming into Uganda and telling the indigenous people of the land what is African and what is not. And I'm so reference to my Christian sisters and brothers, Christianity is not African.
It's not.
Except for the Coptic Church, which is 2,000 years old, and in Egypt and in Ethiopia. Those are historical churches. The other churches came with colonialism. They've been here for 150 years. And now they're telling you what's African and what's not, so that black is killing black because of a law from Europe. I'm going to end on that. So.
How do we, yeah. Any questions?
Comments?
Any
thoughts? Strategies?
Yes, that is what we need to take. Do we take this a legal way forward? You've given one option of, because South Africa is a signatory to so many of our conventions, right? And none of it has ever applied. I don't think in South Africa we've ever taken the state to court for not applying a convention.
Maybe it's time. Right, because we talked about two things, right? We talked about having the law and we talked about enforcing the law.
Yes.
So when we're talking about LGBTIQ issues in South Africa, if the government is not doing anything to address the violence against African lesbians, and they can say, well, we're applying our laws equally, but it's having a disproportionate impact on this population. And so therefore you are failing this population. What's the strategy? Anybody? Ismail.
I want to ask the question. I want to answer it.
Oh.
Challenge.
These two.
The strategy is that you challenge the law. You get the legislation changed. You get it amended.
But there's nothing wrong with the legislation. The legislation is fine. It's the implementation and the enforcement. Right?
Okay.
So what's the strategy? I mean, is there mechanisms? Are there vehicles? I mean, I think these are the conversations that on-the-ground activists need to have. How do we force the government to actually do something, right? Not just talk the talk, but walk it too. Got some thoughts?
Yeah, I think in my experience is that, as I said earlier, in 2009, we had like a high number of LGBTI people being killed in the world, and most of those people were like lesbians from the townships.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the point that you raised is very important, that we also need to look at other issues that connect to the main issue, because issues of class, issues of employment, issues of access to basic services is connected to the fact that it has become blacklisted. And that is an issue in this country. And so what happened was we put up petitions to the government, to the South African government. Hence, the Minister of Justice, who was Japanese, Jeff then had a cry and said, let us establish the National Task Team, which brings together different government departments and different civil society organizations. And this is how it works. Department of Health, Department of Social Development, Department of Justice, Department of Home Affairs, they come and become part of this process. Because each and every department then gets to declare what they're doing with regard to LGBTI issues. And all the issues that as LGBTI people are experiencing, we get to talk about them at that platform. And then the strategy is formulated together with the government's officials. And then we realized that we actually started the house from the roof. Then we needed then to go on the ground and establish the provincial task teams. So all the provincial government departments then become part of the provincial task team. In Popo, there's a provincial task team, in Western Cape, in Gauteng, all the 9 provinces. And when this process started, it started as dealing with hate crimes. But as we began to come together, it was clear that the issue is not only hate crimes, it's also discrimination. Secondary victimization of LGBT people when they go and report their cases, when they go to the health centers, when nurses, professional nurses will be asking you, are you a girl or a boy? And we've come with strategies to address also those issues. And because of time, we're going to talk about them. But if you are interested to know more, you can contact me. I can share all the relevant documents that we've developed, and also some of the organizations that are spearheading some of the issues, especially issues of because their parents are being informed. One of the things that the Department of Social Development has to develop a study to see how many of the young people are here in South Africa, because they will give a very wonderful of how homophobic our society is. And then how do shelters become welcoming to LGBT people and make the shelters to be conducive to the needs of the LGBT.
I just want to pull out a couple of things from there. So we talked about litigation, but lawyers are expensive. And the court processes, and they can be long.
Right.
And again, then you can still get a court decision, but then how does it trickle down, right? But shaming is a really good strategy, and so petitions, very important. I haven't touched on, which is coalition building, right? Sister, I'll march with you. I'm not Black and I'm not lesbian, but I'll march with you, right? So coalition building, like minds, like hearts. And we sometimes only see, I see your hand, sometimes we only see the most extreme examples, but we miss the other stuff, right? So it's great, again, it's great having all these articulations and having stuff up here, but what happens when a gay man or a transgender person gets beaten up and goes to the police, and the police says, are you a boy or a girl? And maybe if you didn't dress that way, this wouldn't have happened to you. So further victimization as well.
We can have all the glamorous legislation, everything in our country. But if we don't start educating these people on LGBT issues, it will just become nice things on papers. So we as activists, we need to start doing that on grassroots level. So it's no use we going there and you have all the legislation. So yeah, that would be a space the answer. We need to start. I'm not. Yeah, we are. But that is in the grand communities. That's the other thing. So come to the grassroots, do the education there, and really, and not just do advocacy work where we just go and march, but really education. And because now they're starting and they're looking at teaching. I'm not quite sure about the word. It's grade 6 that was teaching schools, or grade 6 education. But as you need to get involved there also, and even if it's in schools, you need to try to change that and really create awareness, education at grassroots level.
And I just want to say, I'm just using the LGBTI as an example, right? And I don't want us to fixate simply on this particular community or this particular issue, because the same is true for gender, it's true for HIV status, it's true for immigration, it's for anything. So just take whatever it is and use. I don't want this to be focused, and I want to say only on, but there's a world of oppressions out there and injustices, and let's not forget the rest of them or the intersectionality of many of these oppressions. So I'm sorry, you had your hand up? Yeah? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think my take will be that looking against the laws that we think that are overgrown with time, because if the law does not, if the legislation does not serve us, or if we have overgrown it, it should be changed. So we have to identify the laws. So probably it might not necessarily be the whole law, the whole constitution that is wrong, but there are particular ones that we need to identify and probably change them to fit the time, the existing time.
So obsolete legislation. Sorry, now.
It was just interesting to hear both Virginia and Rishi talking. It just reminded me of an article. As much as we are activists and we look at movement building, we also have to understand, as passionate as activists are about getting their way, there are people who are fighting as hard, opposing that. And it just came to mind when in the newspaper 2 weeks ago, as there is a movement that's pushing for gay rights, there's a movement that's pushing against that. So before you get to legislation or to education, then you need to fight your opposition as well. So the very first step is against your opposition. So I mean, education is very vital, but you need to have strategy against your opposition, because the same way you feel you have a strong point, you know, you need to have a strategy against your opposition, which is as strong, if not stronger, than what you are.
So I'll tell you what's happening in America, from what I understand, right? So, you know, Obamacare, the legislation to require employers to provide health care, right? But now there's a lobby group in America that's fighting for the right to say no to women to have access to sexual and reproductive health if it's against their religious belief. So if it is, so this is being done by evangelical Christians who say that, well, we don't believe in abortion and we don't believe in birth control. So if the employer has those values, those beliefs, then they should be exempt from providing healthcare on those issues to women. Nice, eh? Welcome to America.
Yeah, right. Welcome to America, right? Yeah, because they treat pregnancy as though it's a pre-existing condition, and pregnancy is not a pre-existing condition for women. It's what our body do. So I just wanted to add to the conversation about that. Media attention. I think it's drawing a lot of media attention. Collaborating with people living with HIV always collaborate with prison reform. We always collaborate with LGBT communities because we know that there's so much stigma that we're not going to win it by ourselves. If you know you're dealing with something with stigma, then you're going to have to, like, you know, combine, align yourself with other marginalized communities. Together, you're stronger. And you got not only just combine your media resources, your strategies, and you get a better chance of winning. My question, that was my comment.
Uh-oh.
My question is because CEDAW always bothered me. The Convention for the Eliminate all discrimination against women. The United States has never signed that. And the reason why they haven't signed on because they're afraid that they're not going to be able to treat sex workers the way they want to. They want to have free reign
LGBT rights activists argued that even though sexual orientation or gender identity was not explicitly articulated in some of our human rights legislation, that it was implied because of the framework of the law, that it was implied and it should be read in because it was an analogous ground. And so some of our first victory came through the analogous grounds reading in by going through domestic litigation. Okay? The other thing that was also used domestically is the issue of disproportionate impact. Okay? So until 2003, more than 50% of the 50 states in the United States of America criminalized sodomy. Okay? But it didn't say that it was male-on-male sodomy. It just said sodomy. But the argument was made that this had a disproportionate impact on a particular population, and therefore was discriminatory, and therefore contravened anti-discrimination legislation. Right? So these were two different strategies: analogous grounds and disproportionate impact. So even if your country is not a signatory to an international convention, maybe there might be domestic legislation that can be used in these kinds of ways to keep pushing the legal envelope till we get to Virginia.
Yeah, the point you said about the laws that were actually put up by colonial rulers. In South Africa, we have a nice example where sodomy laws existed. And when the new constitution came into existence in 1993, they still continued up until the organization, National Coalition of Lesbian and Gay, took the matter to the High Court, and from the High Court back to the Constitutional Court. And those laws were then struck down. So you use the existing legislation, which at that time was internal constitution, to strike down the laws that did not,
And was the argument, do you know if the argument was about disproportionate or discriminatory impacts?
The argument was these laws are not actually in the same spirit of the constitution.
Ah, okay. So you look at the preamble and the framing of the Constitution and the objectives of the Constitution. Okay. Good.
One of the things that we falling prey to in this one is also that often when we have this discussion, it hinges on your very language that is outside our regular use, that is all encompassing, but and it tells its own story, but everybody is not into using that particular language. And that is one of the critical reasons why we don't have the same level of grassroots interaction in formulating these laws. So you find a group of activists who's legally framework minded get together and literally craft the legislation. And they chop it together and put it together, not chop it together, they put it together, and it is framed in such a way that everybody, all the citizens in the country doesn't understand it. So you have to unpack some of it. And that is where the activism is really needed. So I'm glad we managed.
So that's about access.
Yes,
access. Right? It's about access, and it's about plain language. Right? I'll tell you a little story. So I went to law school in British Columbia. And they were bringing in plain language. So, you would draft an affidavit and you would just say, I swear that blah, 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 blah. Okay? So I finished law school, I articled, and then I moved to Ottawa, which is in Ontario, a different province. And I had to work in another law firm to get recognized as a lawyer there. And they asked me to draft an affidavit. So I did I did it the way I was taught in law school. Well, Ontario had not introduced plain language. So I get it back and it says, know all ye men by these presents. This is not plain language.
Right.
And what about all the women? Know all ye men by these presents. What the hell is that? Okay, are you giving me something? You know, where's my present? So language also then is used as a way of disempowering and marginalizing people. So plain language is very important, right? So, sorry.
I wanted to say something about HIV criminalization.
Mm.
And I know that it's prevalent throughout the whole world, but we have this movement in the United States. It's called the movement for Black Lives, and they've been fighting back racism and policing.
So Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
Right. So a group of activists, myself included, we went to the first national convening of Black Lives Matter to put HIV on the agenda to collaborate with them to help end HIV criminalization, because we can't end it by ourselves.
Mm.
But we know that if we could get with this group who's fighting back racism, fighting back policing of communities, that we can connect the HIV criminalization, because, you know, like you said, most of the people who are being policed and who are being jailed are people of color. The HIV epidemic right now in the United States are people of color. We're talking about the same people. And knowing that we can't win it by ourselves, these archaic, outdated laws. You talked about sodomy and stuff like that. They're using some very, very outdated laws. And once they convict you of HIV criminalization, which is actually non-disclosure, it's not HIV transmission. Mm. It's non-disclosure of your HIV status.
But
right?
These are not old laws. These are new laws, Wahida.
Yeah, well, yes. Some of them are new laws. Mm. There's a trend of brand new laws specifically for people living with HIV non-disclosure, and you get to be labeled as a sex offender, and they put it on your driver's license. So every time you show your driver's license, no matter, I'm serious, shut her mouth. They put it on your driver's license, so no matter whenever you show your driver's license, you can't get a traditional job. You don't get a traditional job. Women don't get to work in daycare centers no more. A traditional job for a woman, you don't work around children because it's here. You don't get children to sleep over at your house anymore because you're labeled as sex offender now, even though you never touched a child. Right? These laws, so we've been trying to fight this ourselves, so we decided to go to the convening of Black Lives Matter. We're strategizing with them now to keep ending HIV criminalization as a part of their manifesto. They're putting together a manifesto of things they're going to work on and demands they're going to work on. That's going to be one of them.
That's a great strategy, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. That's one of the things. It's one of the things we came up with. So when you talk about movement building, that was big for us, and we found out if we not went there, it would not have been on the agenda. So you have to bring it.